As I said, my name is Ivan Taylor. I'm from Ontario, Canada. And today I'd like to talk to you about what I think System Dynamics can contribute to solving the world's grand challenges. I'll begin by talking about the essence of System Dynamics and the best practices in System Dynamics. And then I'll talk about some of the grand challenges I've seen worked on by System Dynamicists. And then I'll talk about some warnings about the use of System Dynamics. The essence of System Dynamics is stocks and flows. And Barry Richmond says that this is the idea of getting the plumbing right. So many of you probably have seen the bathtub model in System Dynamics, which is an introductory model, and it shows a stock of water in a bathtub and a flow in and a flow out. And although this is a very simple model, very basic idea, it has some very interesting dynamics. For example, the water in the bathtub will continue to increase even though the flow rate decreases. And that's an unusual concept for people to understand. What you may never have seen before is this System Dynamics model of fluids, which is the Phillips hydraulic machine. And this model, which uses pipes and containers and fluids, is a model of a macroeconomic state of a country. And you can control the valves to control interest rates and investments to try to improve the GDP or reduce the unemployment rate or change the inflation rate in an economy. And this model was built in the 1950s and is continually being used today. Now, one of the things about System Dynamics is that really it's just basic physics. And it's basically solving a highly interconnected system of first-order differential equations using numerical integration. And here's a model of a COVID crisis where you can see the classic epidemic model with S representing the number of susceptible people, E representing the number of exposed people, and I representing the number of infected people. And although this is a very complicated model, it is easily solved using numerical methods like Euler integration or Runge-Kutta integration. Now, real-life systems have inertia, and that's a very important part of System Dynamics. So, for example, we often talk about trying to move this iceberg, of moving the system in the right direction. And the thing about the iceberg is you can see the events above the surface, whereas the patterns and the system structure and the mental models are below the surface and not necessarily visible. However, if you want to move the system, you have to move the whole iceberg. And so these people are pushing on this huge iceberg to try to get the system to move. This is another presentation of inertia in modeling, in System Dynamics modeling. And it shows various models which have a pattern of behavior over time, where the past is represented in blue up until the point now, and then the future is represented in green for good and red for black, for bad. And therefore, we want to move the system in the right direction. We want to move it towards a good situation in the future and avoid a bad situation in the future. However, that doesn't change immediately. It does change slowly over time. Another key aspect of System Dynamics is measurement. So here's a part of a model that I wrote for the epidemic of COVID. And you can see that I have a concept of a number of infecting people measured in people per day. And that's a flow rate into the number of infected people, which is measured in people. And so you have to, in System Dynamics, you have to ensure that you're adding apples to apples and oranges to oranges. And so that's, you have to make sure the units are consistent. And one of the aspects of the software that I'm using, EventSim, is that it has a units checking capability. So here's a result of an output of a units check where I was working with this model, and it had 23 unit errors. And those unit errors have to be corrected so that the units add up correctly, and before the model can be presented to people outside of the model building community. Another aspect of system dynamics that's very useful is the idea that you have very clear assumptions. Because you're using a computer simulation, you have to define every variable and the formula that represents every variable. So you can look at the equations of the model and quickly determine not only what the variables included in the model are, but also how they're being used. So I have some various parameters in the model, and you can see various ways they're being calculated and used. And you can also determine what's not in the model by looking at the formulas and realizing that some variables are not listed or not computed. System dynamics can be very easily explained to people that are unfamiliar with the concept by describing every parameter in a model as a column in a spreadsheet. And everyone is familiar with spreadsheets. So here's my model of the COVID epidemic. And you can see my parameters of the model along the first row. These are the names of the various exogenous variables. And then the values are shown in the columns, and you have an idea of time moving downwards in the column, and you have a time step of a 0.125 of a day, and each time step, the numbers are updated in the columns, and that shows the behavior over time. And the values inside each cell represent the connections that are shown in the model, and therefore you can explain a model connection as a cell reference in an Excel spreadsheet. I'll now go on and talk about the need for best practices. One of the things that has been found in the past is that there's been a lot of poor models built and presented at past system dynamics conferences, probably because the software is very easy to use and may be misused by people who don't understand the concepts of system dynamics very well. I saw this analysis of all of the models that were submitted to the conference between 2009 and 2017. And you can see in this table that at the bottom row, you can see that the average number of errors, unit errors per model, was 42 errors per model. And that's an average of 20% of the variables in the models have unit errors. And one model actually had 3,226 unit errors. These are unacceptable numbers, and we need to improve the way we build models. We need to use best practices. Two results of poor models is that at best they can be ignored, and at worst they can be used to make bad decisions. A common archetype in system dynamics is fixes that fail, where someone looks at a problem, builds a model, develops a fix to the problem, and then because the model is poor, the fix leads to unintended consequences that makes the problem worse in the long run. Now, the way I look at building models that are quality models is that basically system dynamics looks at behavior over time. And when you're in the real world, behavior over time is a concept of time series data. So I think you should always start with collecting data and using time series data to build your model. Here's time series data on the daily confirmed cases of COVID in Colombia over a period of time. Here's a model of, here's a time series of data on the number of battles in Syria, so in the Syrian civil war between the period of 2010 and 2018. So these are two time series that I collected before I started working on these models. Now, another aspect of modeling is naming conventions. So for example, in this model shows the simple SIR version of a epidemic. And you can see three basic differences in the way the variables are identified. Stocks are shown as first letter capitals, endogenous variables are shown as all small letters, and parameters outside the model that are input are shown in all caps. And by using these naming conventions, you can quickly see how the model is using the variables. Now, I suggest that if you want to find the values of the external values, you try to fit the model to time series data. And the way I do that, which is one way, it's not the only way, but I try to minimize the sum of the log of the sum of the squared error between the data and the model. So here's some data on COVID in Canada, and it shows the data on the blue line and the model on the purple line. And at the bottom of the graph, I show the logarithm of the sum of squared error for cases and deaths. And I try to minimize that, and I minimize it by varying the parameters shown in the top rows of this spreadsheet. Now, not all parameters can be estimated using data. So, for example, you may have to, because things happen in the future or because no data is available, you may have to make assumptions about the values of the parameters. And when you make assumptions, you need to test the sensitivity of those assumptions. So here's two examples of what I've done with testing the sensitivity of immigration levels and refugee levels in the future. So I have data up until 2018, and then I change various levels of immigration in the bottom right-hand corner graph and show the impact on the number of immigrants being accepted to different countries. So you can see that there's a wide difference in the total number of immigrants based on different levels of immigration to third nation countries. On the left-hand side, I have a graph of refugee levels, and you can see that I have data up until 2018, and then I extrapolate into the future with the idea that the number of refugees is growing because of high birth rates in the refugee camps. And my model looks into the future and says possibly around the year 2030, the war will have been resolved sufficiently that possibly the refugees could return to their native country without fear of their lives being at risk. So then I have various return rates of people returning to their country of origin, and I show the impact of that on the number of refugees. Some of the grand challenges that I have seen worked on by System Dynamists and that I've worked on myself include climate change. For example, this is a model of energy use in the impact on climate change. So you can see on the graph on the left-hand side, the energy use, and the colored lines represent the different types of energy. And the bottom parts of the diagram show these switches that you can use to increase or decrease various parameters in the model. And as you increase, for example, energy efficiency, you'll change the patterns of energy use shown in the left-hand graph. And on the right-hand graph, you'll see that the temperature will change because of different uses of energy. And this is a very dynamic model and a very easy way to show the impact of various policy decisions. Another important area that System Dynamists are working on is the COVID pandemic. And there's an entire page on the System Dynamics website with links to all the work being done by System Dynamists in the area of the pandemic. This is a model that I was working on the COVID pandemic in Colombia and in Canada. And my particular area of interest is the effectiveness of precautions, both voluntary and regulated, on the reproduction rate, that is the spread of the virus. So, so basically, I'm looking, for example, at the value of voluntary precautions rather than regulated precautions to resolve the problem. Another issue in Canada that's very important is First Nations people or Indigenous people. And there's many First Nations people and First Nations communities in Canada where people are living in third world conditions. And in a first world country like Canada, this is an embarrassment and a travesty. So I've looked at trying to improve the economic conditions of the people in the First Nations. And basically, by improving the economy, you will have an impact on the people, and the people will have an impact also as well as the economy will have an impact on pollution levels. And that in turn will have an impact on the land and the productivity of the land. And if basically the land is a central point of issue with the First Nations people, and I've read that if you don't understand the idea of the land, you don't understand First Nations people. Another problem I've been working on is the refugee crisis. And here's some statistics on the number of millions of people that have been displaced because of civil wars. And prior to COVID, this was probably the humanitarian crisis of our time. The UNHCR, which is responsible for handling refugees, is looking at three possible durable solutions. The first, to integrate refugees in neighboring countries and resettle refugees into third countries, I believe is reaching a limit today, and that countries are no longer as willing to accept refugees as immigrants. So I believe that possibly the only solution in the future will be repatriating refugees to their country of origin. So I built a model of the movement of refugees from the crisis country into refugees camps in neighboring countries, and the possible movement back to the crisis country once ceasefires are put in place and safe havens are created and protected by peacekeepers to ensure that the lives of the refugees are no longer in risk if they return to their country of origin. Something that's very important and being studied by the System Dynamics Society today is the issue of structural racism. The System Dynamics Society has set up a special interest group on structural racism, and I've been building models to look into various aspects of structural racism. This is a model that I built to try to reduce the number of shootings during traffic shootings of unarmed Black men at traffic stops. So I have this idea that you have a certain number of police who have various biases, and that will involve various numbers of traffic stops, which could result in violence and therefore shootings. So possibly if we can change the dynamic, we can change the number of bad outcomes in terms of shootings and deaths of Black men. Now, another issue that is very important is corruption. This impacts on humanitarian aid. It also impacts on just the well-being of a country. And this is a model that was built of possible corruption in the government of Pakistan. And you can see it's a bigger model than this, but basically you can see two important aspects on the level of corruption, and that is organized crime, and which increases the amount of corruption, and democratic accountability, which decreases the amount of corruption as it increases. So basically you have this idea of changing the level of corruption by changing the levels of these two different variables, and there's many other variables in this model. The last grand challenge that I'd like to talk to you about is genocide. And this is an important problem. And this is a model, it's a qualitative model, and it shows the nature of people's belief systems and how those belief systems could be changed so that the citizens of a country could believe that genocide was acceptable. And so the idea of the model was to try to cut short the movement of people towards this idea and possibly ensure that people in a country do not accept the idea that genocide is something that is acceptable. I'll now go on to some warnings about the possible misuse of system dynamics. First of all, you have to recognize that system dynamics originally came from the whole idea of servo-mechanical feedback. And the idea of system dynamics came from the mind of Jay Forster, and his first work was in the area of building radar control systems for ships in the Navy. And this is the first system he built, which is obviously a servo-mechanical system to control the radar system. And here's a diagram of a electronic system, which shows a system dynamics diagram. However, when you apply control theory like that, you're also susceptible to something called social engineering, which has been found to be a very bad thing many times. So this book had a large influence on my thinking. It's called Seeing Like a State by James C. Scott, I mean. And it shows on the cover a humorous diagram of a highway in the United States that's built along the longitudinal lines. And because the longitudinal lines are not straight on the globe, that very so often the highway by making these sharp right turns. One of the examples in the book is a scientific forest, which you see on the right-hand side the picture. And the scientific forests were introduced in Europe, and they found that in the first year of the forests, they had a very good yield of harvest of timber and wood. However, in the second year, the harvest was very poor because they had not recognized the idea of nurturing the land and the nutrients in the soil, which would be done naturally in a normal forest. So this was a major oversight of the people who were looking at scientific forestry. Another example from the book is the idea of city planning. And on the right-hand side, you can see a diagram of the streets of Chicago, where the book suggests that possibly this symmetrical design of streets could lead to higher crime rates. Whereas on the left-hand side, you see a very dynamic and adaptive version of the city of Bruges. And the suggestion here is that the design of the city allows the people, the shop owners and the people, to keep an eye on each other and an eye on possible problems to stop the crime rate before it gets too bad. One of the issues of social engineering that has been a particular problem is government coercion. This figure shows the change in the level of equipment in riot control forces, in police forces in the United States. So you can see in the 1960s, the riot control people were very lightly weaponized, whereas as we move into the 2000s and 2010s, at the right-hand side of the diagram, we see that the police forces are basically paramilitary forces, and they're being supplied by military organizations that have surplus supplies. And so the police forces are buying these surplus supplies and using them and in the riot control process, and they're being much more violent than they would be otherwise. One of the good things about control theory is government accountability. And that is a way to make sure that the system works for the people. So for example, if the government is not doing its job, the country can use the democratic means to vote the government out of power and therefore change the system. And this is something that should be recognized in all models of system dynamics change. And encouraged, democracy should be encouraged as much as possible. Also, there's an idea of unintended consequences in system dynamics. Here's a humorous example where people protesting for gun control creates a boost in sales at gun shops, so that the owners of gun shops are happy when the gun control protesters start protesting, because people who own guns and want to own guns will go out and buy guns in larger numbers because they think their guns will be controlled in the future. So my ideas about using system dynamics to improve these systems is by looking for incremental change rather than grand designs. So I have this picture in my mind of using this feedback loop, which shows sensing, deciding, adapting, and acting, and then repeating the sensing again and repeating the loop over and over again in small increments, so that the change is adaptive and incremental rather than some grand design. These are my references, and many of them from the recent System Dynamics conference. And I'll open the floor to questions and comments.